The first thing I'm going to talk about is, we talk about public boards a lot, right? That's what gets most of us talking about governance and joining boards and things like that. What is the biggest differences, or what are the biggest differences in being on a venture capital-backed company from a private equity or public company board? And Lynn, I'm going to start with you because you serve on a few of those public companies and have served on some VC backs. So what's the biggest difference? And I mean, is there a difference? And what does it mean in terms of the board meetings and the day-to-day?
Sure, I think there are differences that are logistical and then differences that are strategic. You know, the first thing that just jumps into my head is probably legal liability. So I mean, when you're on a public board, you're just held to a certain standard, and everything about you and what you're doing is made public. And so I think that you have to be real careful there that you're with a good company, that's reputable, and that you're doing all the right things. So I won't go into all that, but that's a huge difference, is legal liability. And maybe I'm not sure that it's technically legal, but it's just your exposure to it is going to be bigger because people know you're on that board and they see what the company does every single quarter. From a logistical standpoint, most public companies have a 12/31 year end, and most public companies follow the natural quarters, and so the workload gets very spiky. So even in a normal, without anything special going on at the company, you're really spending a lot more time 4 or 5 times a year. Whereas I think on a private board, in my experience there, being on one, and also when I was a CFO with a venture-backed board, is that can be spread out a little bit differently. And it also doesn't even have to be on the normal cadence of a public company board. So those are two differences that I see right off the bat.
Well, you know, the way we get into private boards is because you're at a check. You know, you're the biggest investor, and naturally that comes with a certain set of rights and responsibilities, and you know, and entitlements and duties. So that's typically how we begin our journey in a typical company, is getting on a board. You know, in a public company context, it's you know, of course you get to a certain shareholding, you can agitate to get on the board and so on, but largely boards are based on somebody distinctive and so on, like that, and so and bring a unique expertise to the table, and that's how you end up with the board. Number two is, you know, look, you know, in private boards, when we, especially our first institutional money, this tremendous, we are in the rough and tumble associated with all the unknowns and the dynamic changes that are ongoing all the time in early stage business. We are, you know, actively figuring out how to, what management team needs to look like, what product market do we have product market fit, what product strategy needs to be, and look, you know, our theme is about being, you know, all in on Texas, all in on founders and so on, which just means we are constantly obsessing about all details associated with company building. So, and of course, I did that at Disco when the company was formed. We were at first investors, $2 million check writers at the data formation of the business. So I joined the board along with the founder, just 2 of us on the board then. And as the company grew and we were going public in 21, the founder surprised me by turning to me and said, would I become chairman of the board as a part of going public? And so that's how I'm still the chairman of the board there. And you know, so obviously the business is a lot more mature, and you got more mature management teams, much more well-baked cadence of an operating cadence and operating sales motion and so on. So, you know, we still have some whiteboarding sessions, but largely it's nothing remotely. Of course, that's because of my institutional history with the business, where I've been part of hiring every single person and knew where the bodies are buried and type stuff and the institutional knowledge that's there. But the typical board member at a public company where it's so much more of a mature business, it's much more around, you know, exerting governance and fiduciary duties, and of course providing a certain perspective around the table. Either you have a lot of amazing CFOs end up becoming tremendous board members and heads of audit and so on. So there's a committee orientation, meets, all of that there. So, but the vectors are more around governance and the personal liability you're managing, balancing that with the fiduciary duties there, while the private boards end up being much more so around the rough and tumble and thinking about every little dial that needs to happen with respect to value creation in the business. And of course, comes with expectations, obligations of a check writing that needs to likely happen across multiple rounds of financing. And maybe I'll stop there for a moment to say, at a high level, there lies a distinction between private and public boards there.
Well, for me, my experience on the board comes in two flavors. One is on the business side, it's very early stage startup. So usually just in the food chain, the company will probably come to my firm before it comes to Krishna's. And so I have to talk to founders about the necessity of the board. For many of them, they're first-time founders. What is this board thing? How should you think about this? How should you consider your investors and the check? Because I think the dialogue often goes with this check, they will likely ask for the board position and they will be part of the business building, so make sure that your values are aligned. Because for the founders at my stage, it's very important, I think, everywhere in life to align the values of the humans that are participating in the project, otherwise bad things happen. And I think I'm at the stage in that setting where my job is to educate my founders about the importance of that, the importance of selection, the importance of being picky, and the importance of educating yourself about how to work with the board. Because by and large, the executive that will be tremendously affected, and the team she or he built, it's the first time they're interacting with the board. So as anything else, but you do it for the first time in life, you have to learn about that. So that's one flavor. My first exposure on being on the board was, however, in the context of being on the board of the university. Small university albeit, but it's a very different situation. So I don't know for how many of those that is interesting. I could certainly draw on that experience. And I was really fortunate to have a board chair at that moment who was a really experienced, really patient, really strong leader, and invested a lot in growing us collectively as a board, as well as have a very strong foundation of board orientation, board roles. So I've been schooled really well on how well a performing board operates, but also how you get there, because every board, like my very first board, did not start as a well-performing board, and it became a well-performing board with one very strong chair. So it's a very interesting lesson to be observed as a board member in board leadership that I will never forget.
Yeah, that's a great point. We're really not going to discuss nonprofit boards here today. I serve on 5 different nonprofit boards. Austin's an easy place to get sucked in to nonprofit boards. But getting that practice on a nonprofit board and seeing how a board is run well. Nonprofit boards are famous for 20% of the people doing 80% of the work. And it's pretty good practice if you want to go into the public world as well. This is a question I wasn't thinking about when we talked the other day, but the way you brought this up. So you were talking about larger companies, corporates, who have boards because they've raised money, and now you're the chair of the board of a public company in Disco. They asked you to do that. It's a transition. SPACs. Now, SPACs are not very popular these days, but they were. So there were a lot of small companies that went public via SPAC or some other vehicle. What did they do? And maybe it's still happening a little bit. What did they do in terms of their boards when they transitioned from a venture back to a SPAC? And because you don't have that, they're not mature companies as you were talking about. Is there a difference there?
The only one I know of is that a couple of months after they did that, they hired a search firm, and I got a call. I mean, so they suddenly realized, oh my gosh, we need an independent board member. We need to fill out the board. And so I think my observation was there's a bit of a scramble, is just the best way to put it. And this particular company also, I didn't go any further than a few conversations with them, because I couldn't understand why they were a public company. I mean, they didn't need to be public, and so they got themselves out there through that vehicle, but they were not ready to be a public company. Now they may grow into it and it'll be fine. So I hope for them the best, so that's my only experience with that.
Have you had experience with that?
No, I haven't had experience with SPAC, but obviously, as Lynn said, right, a lot of companies that should not be public end up being public. And that's because as a SPAC, you can provide lots of future guidance, right? And as a public offering, you're very careful about not providing future guidance here. And so SPACs tried to go public by pointing to bright, shiny objects, which are 2, 3, 4, 5 years away. So that happened, and of course they start to run towards getting independent directors in. And then comes this challenge of this little thing called liability, right? So because you're raising money, raising stock, raising money on the aspect of futures, as a director, you can't quite control your ability to achieve those futures. That's why there's a tremendous number of lawsuits associated with SPAC entities with had that sort of profile to go public. And so obviously we even explored that and said at Disco we're going to take it public the good old-fashioned way on the NYSE through a normal process, right? And as opposed to going to the SPACing methods.
And the rule is that every public company who goes public has to have 2 independent board members. Is that right? Or
I'm not sure, but it depends on whether it's NYSE or NASDAQ too. So, and there's different rules, but it's kind of more around audit committee too. So that's what and you have a certain amount of time to get there. So I can't quote it to you, but they give you an amount of time. There's a certain number. It depends on which exchange, and it depends on, and you first start with audit.